I am going to kick off the Mid-Atlantic Ocean Forum and turn it over to Mike Snyder from New York, who's the chair of MACO, which is the Mid-Atlantic Council on the Ocean, to get the meeting going. Thank you very much. We are waiting, apparently, for 1 second for online sound to come on. Okay, so somebody tell me. So I will now sing a song? No, absolutely, I will not do that. Again, hopefully you all have looked at the agenda and see the arc of the meeting, but I think we are now ready to go. So with that, I will turn it over to Mike and the first panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. And you're lucky because I was going to start juggling, and nobody wants to see me juggle because that's embarrassing for all of us. Good morning, and welcome to the 2023 Mid-Atlantic Ocean Forum. Welcome to New York City, and welcome back to in-person meetings. It is so great to see people in person again. It's so great to be here with all of you, whether you are here in person or whether you are joining us online. We really appreciate your continued dedication and commitment to the Mid-Atlantic Ocean. We appreciate you, your partnership, your work, your efforts, your collaboration, and we thank you. We thank you for being here with us today. Before we begin, let's please take this moment to acknowledge where we are today at the Museum of the American Indian. We'd like to take a moment of purposeful silence to acknowledge the history, the path, the pain, and the triumph of indigenous nations and peoples across the United States and here on this land that we call Manhattan. We respect the ancestors and their experience, and we move in the direction of intentional, collaborative stewardship today. Please join me in this moment of silence. Thank you. Throughout our discussions the next couple of days, you will notice that our emphasis on inclusion and a just ocean approach is permeating everything we do. This is fully intentional and reflects our efforts to institutionalize our DEIJA commitment within our Mid-Atlantic Partnership. It feels so good to be here in person, and I am so grateful that many of you are able to be here to join us as well. As one of the outcomes of the pandemic, and as Tony mentioned, we are attempting a hybrid meeting the next couple of days. So we would just ask for your patience as we work out any last kinks. But we would also ask your continued participation, whether you are in person or online. I know it can be a little challenging to be both in person and online in a meeting. So we're going to make every effort to make folks who are viewing remotely feel as included as possible. In the meantime, I ask that you all enjoy what we have to offer during the forum, and especially take a moment to reach out to the person next to you, whether there's someone you know or somebody you don't know. Take advantage of this opportunity to be meeting in person, to reconnect, to recharge, to re-energize our partnerships, because we know those partnerships are so critical to facing the challenges and to achieving the opportunities that are before us. This morning, I took advantage of the beautiful weather to go for a short jog, more like a fast walk around Lower Manhattan. And it was hard not to be struck by the challenges facing the city these days. In particular, I noticed both the West and the East Sides have resilience projects that are actively underway as we face the urgency and very real presence of climate change. We also know that the opportunities to transition to a just and renewable future are also before us, and ones that we need to be collaborative in finding ways to achieve. And at the same time, being respectful and being appreciative of the biodiversity and the important offshore habitats that sustain our ocean economies. Truly, these are monumental, generational challenges that we face, but I'm invigorated by everybody here, your presence, your energy. I'm looking forward to engaging with all of you, to hearing from our panelists, to meeting with you one-on-one, and to having a great couple of days. So without any further ado, thank you very much for being here today, and I will turn it over to Kristi Lieske to start our first panel. Kristi?
Thank you, Mike. Hi, my name is Kristi Lieske. Oh, yes, sorry, let's give him a round of applause. My name is Kristi Lieske, and I'm the ocean planner for the Delaware Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control. I'd like to welcome you all to the first session of our Ocean Forum. We're really excited to kick it off with Oceans and Climate Change, Advancing Mitigation, Resilience, and Equity. As you all are probably aware, the interactions of climate and ocean are the major driver of ocean planning in the Mid-Atlantic. And that's reflected in a broad range of actions that are working to mitigate the carbon emissions. And you see that in offshore wind energy development, greening of ports. We see it in adapting to sea level rise and ocean acidification. And as these actions are being identified, we're recognizing across all levels of government and all sectors that there's a need to inform with equitable and just and inclusivity throughout these planning processes. So today we're here to hear about these actions that the federal, state, and others are implementing and planning to mitigate those carbon emissions and climate change. And we will also be hearing about what we can consider as those actions are being moved forward, how to make them the equitable and inclusive as possible. So I have this wonderful set of speakers here, and you'll be hearing from them. We'll also have some interactive audience polling. We're going to be having a panel discussion towards the end and an opportunity for questions and answers from the audience. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panel. We first have Mackenzie Solomon. She is the Deputy Director of Ocean and Coastal Policy at the White House Council on Environmental Quality, where she works on a myriad of ocean issues and serves as a policy advisor to the Interagency Ocean Policy Committee and the Subcommittee on Ocean Research Management. Before CEQ, Mackenzie worked for 12 years at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in Congressional Affairs and as a policy advisor to the acting administrator. Before NOAA, Mackenzie worked for a member of Congress on science and environmental policy. Mackenzie currently lives in Tarrytown, New York. Welcome, Mackenzie. Thanks for being here. And then next to her, we have Kisha Santiago. She is the Deputy Secretary of State with New York's Department of State. She's at the forefront of efforts to advance sustainable, equitable, and resilient development, expand New Yorkers' access to offshore wind energy, improve climate resiliency and mitigation at regional and local levels, and protect and restore the state's coastal and ocean ecosystems. As Deputy Secretary of State at New York Department of State, Ms. Santiago oversees the Office of Planning, Development, and Community Infrastructure's expansive portfolio of programs and activities, represented the Secretary of State on the Governor's Climate Action Council, is Commissioner of the Great Lakes, and is the former chair of the 5-state Mid-Atlantic Regional Council on the Ocean. Thanks for being here, Kisha. Thank you. Then next to her, we have Dr. Miranda Bernard. She is a David H. Smith Conservation Research Postdoctoral Fellow at Duke University. She is a conservation social scientist who studies the interactions between people and the environment. She has worked on issues ranging from marine protected areas, plastic pollution, fisheries certifications, and environmental disasters. Thanks, Miranda, for being here. And Sarah is next to Miranda. Sarah Colasurdo is a senior climate resilience specialist for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Situated in the engineering department, Sarah and her colleagues in resilience and sustainable design endeavor to develop strategies that reduce the risk posed by climate change to the Port Authority's facilities and operations in a sustainable manner. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today. And finally, but not least, we have Dr. Paul Phifer. He is the Permitting and Development Director at Attentive Energy. Attentive Energy, which is a subsidiary of Total Energies, is developing a lease area off the coast of New York and New Jersey. We'll be hearing from Kisha Santiago.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. It is such a pleasure to be here with you. On behalf of Governor Hochul and Secretary of State Rodriguez, welcome to New York. I'm so honored that we're hosting the 5th Annual Mid-Atlantic Ocean Forum and looking forward to discussions and knowledge sharing over the next 2 days. I want to officially start with some accolades because I am so extremely proud to be a New Yorker and to be working as a public servant during this period in time when we are finally serious, or to use a scientific term my 7-year-old says, super duper serious on climate. Under Governor Kathy Hochul's leadership, we are approaching climate resilience with intense intentionality, setting goals with associated action plans, marshaling resources, bringing in the whole picture on impacts and benefits, and most importantly, creating a culture that is all in, with agencies working in their area of expertise and influence on how to protect, mitigate, and adapt to climate change. We're shepherding in the energy transition with real committed focus on equity and working exceptionally hard to bring people who have legitimate concerns about how this transition may affect them, which includes a better accounting and education on how doing nothing will harm them more. I was asked to provide the state's perspective, but to do that, I have to talk a little bit about the directional pathways of climate policy between federal, state, and local governments. State coordination, especially at the regional level like the Mid-Atlantic, is a driver for federal policy. The ocean doesn't care who claims authority over it. So while neighboring states are not always aligned on many major policy issues, we know both federal and state policies that affect the coastal areas in one area have the ability to affect us all. This coordination over the years has resulted in joint requests related to data, programming, funding, and regulatory reform from federal government, and an opportunity to be more responsive to our coastal communities and the blue economy. This is not easy work, but over time, the building blocks were formed and a platform for constructive dialogue about what the state and local needs are from the federal government formed. This existing coordination has been absolutely monumental during the Biden and Harris administration, because not only are so many states completely focused on resilience to climate change, but the historic Inflation Reduction Act is giving us the ability to move so many discussions and plans into action. Federal entities like BOEM, NOAA, and EPA are rolling out programs and initiatives responsive to the state's asks, like concerted efforts to launch the offshore wind industry and local supply chain that is investing in underserved and underrepresented communities, like the incredible EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund that will mobilize private capital for clean energy and climate projects, with an emphasis on benefiting low-income and disadvantaged communities. NOAA has been such an incredible partner in investing heavily in resiliency planning for coastal communities and supporting the states as we work with local governments. I also want to applaud BOEM for their incredible energy mobilized in the offshore wind industry, but also for the rulemaking that they're coming out, which is streamlining leasing and permitting of offshore wind projects. This is answering the state's request to amend the START for Federal Consistency Review with the publication of the DEIS. That has been really important for the states. New York State is a leader in offshore wind with approximately 4,300 megawatts currently under development, with at least another 2,000 megawatts to be awarded this year. This will surpass the halfway mark in our efforts to meet the state's landmark Climate Act targets, which continues to represent the most ambitious and comprehensive climate and clean energy legislation in the nation. We're also undertaking a second offshore wind master planning process, dubbed Master Plan 2.0, that will explore and position the state to take advantage of opportunities in deeper waters greater than 60 miles, expand its position as the hub for offshore wind energy by leveraging the emerging supply chain and expertise, in addition to other actions like exploring the potential for floating offshore wind energy technologies. State leadership continues to be a driving force to solidify America's foothold in the offshore wind industry. And what I love most about the Mid-Atlantic is that our 5 states, while all setting our own targets, and in many ways in a bit of competition with one another, we are also so supportive of one another because we know how important carbon reduction and climate change resilience is to us all. New York State Department of State looks forward to continuing to working with our Mid-Atlantic states as well as the Northeast, and also learning so much from the West Coast. Another area of excitement is that there are 2 national sanctuaries designations in process right now off our New York shores. The first is on New York's north coast in eastern Lake Ontario, which will protect more than 24 shipwrecks spanning 200 years of history. The Hudson Canyon National Marine Sanctuary will protect the largest submarine canyon on the East Coast and one of the largest in the world at over 2 miles deep and 7.5 miles wide. Sanctuaries provide tremendous opportunity for education, non-invasive exploration and recreation, collaboration in the advancement of scientific research on unique and irreplaceable resources. And possibly more important, sanctuaries build tangible connections between people and our amazing ocean resources that help strengthen the collective conservation ethic and propel state and national policies forward. As a state that is focused on carbon reduction and ocean conservation, we are so excited to play a role in demonstrating how sanctuaries and offshore renewable energy development can be complementary. Both underscore the importance of our ocean health and resources and need to forge a sustainable energy future. The Department of State is this incredible agency that sits at the confluence of both ocean and Great Lakes priorities and those of our coastal and inland communities. We do not have a boundary separating our programs because our communities, our economy, and our ability to adapt and strengthen climate resilience occurs in both of those spaces. The office I oversee in particular must look out into the future, way out into the future, to the challenges that our great state will face, and then take actions to adapt, prevent, and make sure we are at the core, creating an equitable and sustainable future for the state. We are committed to providing communities across the state with resources they need to understand potential climate risks, as well as the full range of measures that can help increase their climate and coastal resilience. And we're also in the middle of studies that will help to inform adaptive management solutions, like blending critical seagrass restoration projects with the development of a suitability index to determine cost-effective strategies, and to monitor and predict how climate change may impact important marine resources. We're also hosting our university partnerships for innovative climate solutions, where we're breaking up some of the most difficult, highly emotional climate adaptation strategies into very small parts, and partnering with the diversity of programs at colleges and universities across the state to do a deep dive. By using a variety of lenses, psychosocial, behavioral, economic, architectural, marketing, and communication, we're developing a local-led state manager tree program that aims to support the whole person and the whole community, to understand the unique needs of an effective community and their attachment to place, and one that supports communities before, during, and after their homes are sought to be bought out. I'm also excited to share that the Department of State is developing initiatives to help green New York ports in order to reduce their environmental footprint, create sustainable operations in the face of changing energy and economic context, and improve the lives of communities members living around port facilities. By working collaboratively with the maritime sector, we will help ports and communities grow more sustainably together. And we're excited by the $3 billion in Clean Ports funding recently announced by the Biden and Harris administration, and the renaissance our working waterfronts are experiencing to support offshore wind industry, encouraged through federal and state grants and public-private partnerships, like Governor Hochul's $200 million investments in New York's third offshore wind solicitation. We're looking forward to sharing much of that work in the future. And at the state and regional level, we're working on major issues like ocean acidification and active in technical working groups that provide regional perspectives across state and federal boundaries to gain a better, cross-sector understanding of perspectives and limitations to promote coexistence of offshore and other ocean-based solutions to climate resilience with incumbent users of the ocean and its many inhabitants. On that note, everything we do, and increasingly so, is so tied to the equity lens. The New York State Climate Act mandates that at least 35%, with the goal of 40%, of the benefits of New York State's climate spending go to disadvantaged communities. Within my office, I have set up a dedicated team to ensure that diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and accessibility serve as the foundation of our work. So, from the state's perspective, what do we need from all of you? First is focused, deliberative action on climate change. We need to seriously acknowledge that we are currently in the best place we have ever been to take bold and swift advances in addressing climate change. And anyone who studies history knows you must move quickly when there's alignment, because there is always a period in time where things take a few steps back. Over more than a decade, states have been working regionally to align goals, incorporating the needs of their local governments. And today we have a federal administration that is not only moving historic legislation and massive funding towards climate change, but is also doing it in a way that, one, is making it possible for states who for years have been going it alone, put plans into action, but two, making it nearly impossible for those states whose culture, history, and belief systems struggle with aligning on these issues to ignore the real threats of climate change and the opportunities investing in renewable energy can bring, whether it's in job growth, workforce training, public health, and attracting young professionals. Second is to cast your timeline far and wide when you're talking about climate resilience, and especially when working on strategies to address it. We are often hindered by a 20-year-old view that what needs to be done because we're often hindered by a 20-year-old view of what needs to be done because we didn't respond to earlier calls of action. We are way past that. When we look at impacts, we have to more seriously include how the ocean and its inhabitants and users will be impacted if we do nothing or suffer from elongated paralysis from analysis. We need a broader lens of the scope of both the problems and the things we are trying to solve and prevent from happening. Number 3, we need to match bold action with clear commitment so that we can develop trust in our own abilities to think ahead of our comfort zone and plan and mitigate to the best of our abilities and course correct if needed. We need to harness the alignment we have today to be bold, inclusive, and intentional, to advance the infrastructure needed to ensure this work continues void of politics and competing priorities at the national, state, and local level. We also need to fight the fear of not having all the science available so that we can pursue the science of understanding, a bit more unleashed, outside of self-designed boundaries. I say anchor your boldness with commitment because an anchor grounds us, but it does not mean we remain stationary. We need to move on climate aggressively with foundational commitments. We in the public sector need to help inform solution-oriented direction, inform the solution-oriented direction of emerging technology and research without stifling it with all the responsibilities we individually have as being public servants. We need to create the room and space to brainstorm with a wide set of industries, even those who may seem at cross purposes of our own. I would just like to point out that when we are trying to darken the color blue in oil painting, we add orange. And I say that because it's not what you would think. So sometimes we really do need to reach well beyond what we think we need. My 4th action item has more to do with personal growth and perspective. The rising tides, frequent storms, and recorded erosion is reshaping how we relate to our work and who we include in our stream of solution. Thinking about ocean geographically and in terms of science limits our perspective. Traditional science-defined roles have unfortunately left out marginalized and exploited groups that have not been traditional power holders or authority figures in our society. This can be seen in how we see our own work as either only science or policy. It also causes us to not see our own role and connections in this space. A few years ago, Mike Snyder and I led a workshop at the Ocean Forum in 2018, and when I asked who works on resiliency, only about 5 people raised their hand. I simply don't believe that. Instead, I think they had a view of what it means and just didn't see their connection. The ocean is a living history, it's an industry, and it is the future. We have a responsibility and a role to shape a path towards what the future of our ocean looks like from broad perspectives, not the loudest ones to the ones most immediately affected or the ones immediately affected. None of us have all of the answers when we incorporate a diversity of voices at the table. We know we will benefit greatly since team diversity is tied directly to the creation of more solutions, more ideas, and more approaches. All of this benefits us. So the next thing I want you to do is to make sure you attend tomorrow's 9:15 Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Allyship in Action workshop. Some wondered whether or not the Ocean Forum was an appropriate place for this DEI workshop. So let me just say the act of asking is a sign that it is absolutely the right place. Because DEI lens is about diversity of thought and approach, inclusion of the wisdom and shared experiences of others, and equity where the burden is borne and the benefit is gained, and that there is a role for all of us. On a small scale, we talk about protecting public access to the waterfront by preventing a death by 1,000 cuts. But when we talk at large scale about climate change, we need to approach our fight in 1,000 cuts. We all have a role. When we apply that DEI equity lens, we begin to look at things more broadly. That lens spills over into our research. It expands the voices and the types of experts we seek. I also want to say that we need to also approach this work with a bold action anchored in commitment with a bit of curiosity and wonder. Lastly, we are the ones that will either mitigate or exacerbate our climate trajectory. So when you get back home after this conference, the last thing I want you to do is I want you to look at the youngest person you love. Look them in the eyes and tell them, I will do all I can to make your future right. This is my duty, this is my job. So let's all get to work. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Kisha. We are going to do a quick audience polling of a Mentimeter question that I will put on the screen. So grab your smartphones. September, if you could help me start that Menti, that would be wonderful. Thank you. So the Menti question is, rank the level of importance for the Mid-Atlantic Ocean for the priorities areas outlined below from the Ocean Climate Action Plan. We just heard a lot from a federal perspective on the OCAP and from some state perspectives on climate actions. So based on those presentations and based on your own opinions, please rank each of those areas. Give a few minutes to finish that out. Should have had some nice elevator music playing or an ocean wave. Next time. Okay, I'll give you about 30 more seconds. All right, so it looks like sustainable ocean ecosystems, offshore wind and marine energy, environmental justice, and engage indigenous peoples, and ocean science, research, observations, forecasting, and knowledge. Those are all really up there, as well as climate-ready fisheries. Thank you for participating. This is going to really help MACO inform our priorities, and I appreciate you participating. And so now I would like to hand the mic over to Miranda Bernard. Thanks, Miranda.
Thank you, Kristi, and thank you for the introduction, and to all the organizers who brought us all here together. Building on what Kristi said, I would like to say that my interests lie in the intersections of people and the environment, with an emphasis on how people are affected differently and to various extents. I currently sit in academia, collaborating with other researchers and practitioners at environmental NGOs and activists. And over the past few years, I've had the great experience of working with a nonprofit, Black in Marine Science, whose aim is to increase diversity in marine science fields. And I've been working with them, finding and writing grants. And I say all this just to provide some context for my thoughts this morning. So one theme that spans all of my work and interests is justice and equity. So that's kind of how I'm going to frame everything this morning. There are 3 categories that are frequently used to describe justice: recognitional, procedural, and distributional justice. And as a quick overview, procedural justice refers to the meaningful participation and inclusivity in decision-making processes, whereas distributional justice is centered on the fairness of benefits and harms of decisions or actions on various groups. So procedural, about the process, and distributional, the outcomes of those processes. And thinking about the procedural justice for many interventions and policies and actions, there are a few things that I wanted to discuss with you all. One is about engagement. Engagement we frequently think of as a good thing. You hear it a lot in context of community engagement, stakeholder engagement, but important thing that I've worked on in my research is understanding that, like most things in life, engagement is a spectrum. It's not inherently a good thing, and that's something to consider when engaging with collaborators or stakeholders, community members. It ranges in things such as sharing information to full-on co-development of said intervention. And something to think about a lot is the power of who you're engaging with and understanding the dynamics between yourselves and the people you're engaging with. You know, I'm sure we have all been on the receiving end of engagement in politics, in work, and whatever it may be, and we see that we go through an entire process and then the outcomes have nothing to do with what we voiced or what we were feeling. And so I think that's something to be very mindful of when you're doing engagement processes. Is the engagement quality, or are you just checking a box? And who are you engaging with? If you have a town hall meeting, who's there and who's not there? You may try to make it as accessible as possible, but ultimately there may not be a venue or a time that works for everyone. So considering who's not there and how can you get them involved. Another aspect is collaboration. It's a very important part of procedural justice, and it takes time. One action within the Ocean Climate Action Plan that Mackenzie presented on centers the importance of interagency collaboration alongside tribal nations, states, communities, the private sector, and civil society. As I am sure many of you are aware, that it takes a lot of time to build meaningful relationships with people, and that's okay. It's just the nature of building authentic partnerships. Having been both on the initiating and the receiving side of collaboration, some things that I have learned that have worked well is really just listening and coming with an open mind and no set agenda, or even if you have an agenda, being able to, be adaptive and react to what people are telling you. So asking people what their ideas are, how can we help, what do you need, are great starting points. And in that same vein, it's important to understand the context. Who are you working with? Where are you working? What are the ecological, geological, social histories of the place and the people you're working with? And also, what are the histories with collaboration within that community or group with outsiders or even insiders? I once spoke with a marine protected area manager, and he grew up in a community, lived there his whole life, knew all of the fishers who fished in the waters surrounding the MPA, but as soon as he had his manager hat on, nobody wanted to talk to him because of his position in the history of distrust and power abuses in that scenario. So it's not just who you are, but it's also the history of those relationships. Thinking about distributional justice now, this can relate to things such as knowledge, anything from knowledge to tangible resources. And I was thinking about this, and there's the institutional side of distribution of resources and then the community and individual side. From the institutional side, I think a lot of my work with Black and marine science, and we've heard about the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, and with those comes a lot of money that's open to different community organizations, researchers, et cetera. But thinking about like how do people access that money and who is getting access to that money, I think about a lot, because anyone who's written a grant, which I'm sure is a lot of people in this room, it takes a lot of work, and some organizations have a lot more capacity than others. So the money and the resources may be there, but the access to those resources may not actually be equitable. And then thinking more about the community and individual level about distributional justice, something I think about a lot in my work is trade-offs. There's no one solution that is gonna make everyone happy and with the most amount of resources that they could possibly have. It's just not realistic. And so we have to just acknowledge those trade-offs, and I think of them a lot in terms of time. What do those trade-offs look over time, over space? And so that could be physically and geographically space, and then groups. So when we think about the current and predicted effects of climate change and our potential interventions, how do those play off over time in different spaces with different people? And those trade-offs to themselves are multidimensional. They include all aspects of well-being. We could think about those trade-offs with respect to monetary benefits, psychological and physical dimensions, and these are all subjective decisions and ways that we have to think about this information, because we can't you can try to put a price on psychological benefits, but it's not the same as pure monetary benefits. So thinking about all the different trade-offs and who they're affecting and why. And another layer to all of this is thinking about the direct and indirect impacts. And so that's something I work with a lot in my current research, looking at the impacts of hurricanes on people. And that goes along, we see the effects of Hurricane Sandy over a decade later. And a lot of the impacts are not ones that people immediately associate with hurricanes. They're indirect, and we have to weigh those in with our decisions as well. So in conclusion, I thought I would summarize or just talk about one sentence in the action plan that I really liked. It was, climate change crosses scientific disciplines, geographic boundaries, cultural perspectives, and socioeconomic lines. So I really like this sentence, and I just want to add that not only does climate change cross these spaces, but it interacts with them differently, and that's a big focus of my work. And climate change's catastrophic and differential effects necessitate innovative strategies to safeguard vulnerable populations. And I hope these are some thoughts that we can have more discussions on today and tomorrow. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Miranda. And next we have Sarah.
Thank you. Or do I need to turn this on, or is it on? Okay, it's already. I never know. I'm Sarah Colasurdo. I'm the Senior Climate Resilience Specialist at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, and I'm very honored to be part of this conversation today. The Port Authority is a bi-state agency with a mission to keep the region moving, particularly as it pertains to the Hudson River crossings and the movement of goods and people out of our ports and airports. We have a very diverse portfolio of buildings and infrastructure and many challenges and many opportunities for improving our resiliency to climate change and sustainability. Within our 1,500 square mile port district, we own and/or operate 5 airports, 2 tunnels, 4 bridges, the Port Authority bus terminal, the PATH rapid transit system, the World Trade Center, and then our seaports at Port Newark, Elizabeth Port Authority Marine Terminal, Port Jersey, Howland Hook, and the Brooklyn Marine Terminal. The Port of New York and New Jersey is the gateway to one of the most concentrated consumer markets in North America. We're the largest container port on the East Coast, and as of 2023, we're the busiest in the country. In 2022, the port moved almost 9.5 million TEUs, and we handle half of the TEUs in the North Atlantic from Norfolk to Montreal. And this equates to approximately $271 billion worth of goods in 2022. And at those facilities, we operate container terminals. Well, we don't operate, sorry, we're the Port Authority for container terminals, cruise terminals, automotive processing, bulk and break bulk cargo, and refrigerated cargo. And the Port Authority strives to be a leader in port sustainability and resiliency because continuity of operations is imperative to our regional economy, and we need to be good partners and neighbors to accomplish this. The agency has made sustainability one of our 6 pillars, and I can honestly say that having executive leaders who truly champion sustainability makes our jobs easier every day because it sends a clear message that sustainability is integral to the way we do business. The Port Authority was the first transportation agency to sign into the Paris Climate Accord, and in 2021, the Port Authority became the first transportation agency to embrace the Biden administration's net zero greenhouse gas emissions 2050 target. And we plan to achieve this through a combination of electrification, renewable energy, building efficiency, and clean construction. I'll touch on some of the agency-wide initiatives and some specific to the port. And as a landlord port, it's important to understand that the Port Authority has to advance our commitments by working closely with a variety of stakeholders, including our port partners, terminal operators, and the trucking community through a host of environmental initiatives aiming to reduce our emissions. While the port has seen continuous growth in cargo volume, handling a 32% increase in cargo volume over the last decade, the port has also been able to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions over that time frame through these various environmental initiatives. Across the agency, we have longstanding sustainable design guidelines, which encompass building guidelines and infrastructure guidelines that align with best-in-class systems from LEED and the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure, as well as a green infrastructure design manual, which showcases how to manage water on-site and reduce runoff to our rivers and oceans. Our energy efficiency program has been the biggest source of greenhouse gas reductions achieved to date, primarily through the installation of LED lighting, upgrading antiquated HVAC equipment, building envelope improvements, and replacement of equipment nearing the end of their lives with high efficiency upgrades. And looking forward, we're exploring options of eliminating fossil fuel burning equipment and deploying smart building technology. Electrification across our facilities is going to take a long time, but we're planning and investing in greater capacity to handle the loads of our facilities today and in the future. We've committed to a 100% electric light-duty vehicle fleet by 2030 and 50% electric medium and heavy-duty fleet by 2035. And we're rapidly installing level 1 and 2 chargers across our facilities to support our fleet, as well as the electric vehicles of our staff and customers and tenants and even drayage truckers. Where specialized equipment isn't yet available as electric, the Port Authority is incentivizing the purchase of cleaner options such as cleaner cargo handling equipment, and we'll continue to update those requirements to progressively more stringent requirements to reduce emissions as more zero emissions vehicles come onto the market. And along the lines of cleaner supply chain, the Port Authority incentivizes to drayage truck owners to replace old trucks with newer, cleaner trucks, and the Clean Vessel Incentive Program rewards vessels that make voluntary engine, fuel, and technology enhancements that reduce emissions beyond regulatory environmental standards. And the vessel speed reduction program incentivizes ships to operate at slower speeds throughout the year and extends the area for speed reduction, which burns less fuel, thereby reducing air pollutants, CO2 emissions, and safer for marine animals. Seeking opportunities for renewable energy at our facilities is an ongoing effort as we seek to maximize solar generation at our facilities by targeting rooftop spaces and parking lots and coordinating with our tenants to find opportunities within their leaseholds. Not a port, but at JFK, we're building the New York City's largest solar project with approximately 12 megawatts of power and 7.5 megawatts of battery storage. The JFK project is also a community solar project, and it'll provide clean electricity to JFK as well as homes in that area. We're also making huge strides in clean construction, which includes updating our specifications to require higher recycled content in our materials, low carbon concrete mixes, low emissions construction vehicles, and construction waste reduction. And we're testing new materials like specialized concrete mixes that are meant to have better environmental performance in marine environments. And we also have implemented our climate resilience design guidelines since 2015 to enhance the design of Port Authority projects to mitigate risk of sea level rise and storm surge throughout the service life of the project. And we're also embarking on an agency-wide climate risk assessment to model, prioritize, and mitigate our biggest climate risks from sea level rise, storm surge, extreme precipitation, and extreme heat. To conclude, the Port Authority plays a key role as a leader and an influencer in the region and nationally. The transportation sector is one of the largest sources of emissions, and we operate some of the most prominent transportation assets in the largest U.S. market. And I've outlined many of our own initiatives, but I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the amazing work being done by others in the region, on land, on the waterfront, and in our rivers and bays, as we all work together to enable collective action for a more resilient and sustainable region. And I can't help but notice that, well, it's not up there anymore, but y'all just listed 5th out of 8 at green shipping industry, and that was like Sophie's choice. I mean, all 8 of those options were important, but I hope that I can convince you that it's really super important to green our shipping industry.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And Paul?
Thanks, Kristi, and thanks to my fellow panelists. It's a privilege to be up on stage with you all. So it's often said that these are turbulent times for offshore wind. Significant inflationary pressure, uncertain regulatory environment, no supply chain system yet. Those can be daunting challenges. And consider this business model. Say year one, you spend $600 million or so to buy a lease, which doesn't give you the right to build a project. It gives you the opportunity to try. You spend probably the next 5 years doing site characterization surveys. You build up a team, you design a project, you try to get it permitted, try to win an agreement with the state, sort of your golden ticket. You probably spend another $300 million. You're 6 years in, $900 million. And then you get to refinance and spend a couple years building it. So now you're probably 8 years in, $10 billion in. And then, like your mortgage, you have to pay the debt service. So you're probably 20 plus years in from when you start, billions of dollars in before you start making any profit. And I know what you're thinking, right? These are big oil and gas companies, but they're still for-profit companies. And that's a daunting challenge. So why do all this? Why take that risk? Well, I think the reason is because those challenges are also opportunities, and there's just a huge amount of potential here with offshore wind. There's a massive amount of potential for renewable electrons. So BOEM says that by 2025, they'll have reviewed or will be reviewing 16 projects, 16 offshore wind projects. Combined, that totals 27 gigawatts of offshore wind. And just a shout out to BOEM, that's a massive amount of work that they'll undertake in just a few amount of years. 27,000 megawatts under review. Now, not including the JFK project, which sounds really cool, most utility solar projects are 5 megawatts or less. So those 27 gigawatts offshore, you would need more than 540 onshore solar farms. So it's a massive amount of electricity in a handful of projects. There's also the potential to set up a supply chain, a just and equitable supply chain. So that challenge of no supply chain, it's a huge, huge opportunity. We can do so in a manner where we help address past and current environmental injustices, where we can replace old tech with new tech. Old tech where we burn things to create electrons, as opposed to new tech where we capture electrons and move them around. We can create a supply chain, just not of goods, but we can create a workforce development chain that captures, that gets people good-paying jobs and careers. So shifting just from the goods we create to the people that we create to service, to build this next generation of infrastructure. We can engage those tribal communities, those indigenous people, and offer opportunities that don't even exist yet. Ultimately, with offshore wind, we have the potential to do more than we currently can. Yet, obviously, we need to keep improving. Developers, I think, could use more incentive. We could use more practice. We could do better at collaborating, to be smarter about how to work together. We all have tight timelines. We all have a lot of work to do. We're still operating fairly independently. We could do better at surveying together, to be innovative together, to create new technologies together. This is happening more and more, and states and the federal governments are encouraging it more and more, but there's a lot of work to be done there. We could also use more help from the state and federal governments to clear the path for this type of work. Again, time is tight. There's a lot of uncertainty, as I mentioned. We could use more opportunities like what we've seen in New York and New Jersey, where they go ahead and they survey and collect some basic information, environmental information, at-sea information that we can then all use collectively in our projects. That type of clearing the path will help us all be successful. BOEM, as mentioned, is doing a programmatic environmental impact statement. That kind of upfront, smart work, it takes time, but I think we'll all benefit in the end. We could also use more incentive and more effort to innovate on opportunities to create that new tech. The Ocean Climate Action Plan talks about things like carbon dioxide removal, nature-inclusive design, augmenting fisheries habitat. Great ideas. We're all sort of independently and somewhat collectively trying to do it. But it's hard to be creative when we're just trying to get the basics right. So are there ways that we can be incentivized? Are there ways that we can be required to come up with some of these ideas? Are there regulations or lease stipulations that can be cleared up that allow us to be innovative, allow us to pilot? I think Kisha mentioned this. How do we look to these creative solutions? I think you mentioned the orange added to deepen the color. What are those out-of-the-box ideas where we can pilot things now? It's not always easy to just add a few pilot projects to a large infrastructure project. The regulations don't always allow it. The lease doesn't always allow it. So how do we work together to experiment, knowing that some of these ideas are going to fail, but knowing that we need to get better at some of our technology? I think overall, offshore wind is an idea whose time has come in the U.S., and I think collectively, if we work together, not only can we meet those climate change targets, but we can provide even more than we think now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think you all had wonderful, wonderful considerations for us all to learn about and hear about today. So thank you for all those. We're going to move on to our panel discussion. And so hearing about all these different actions that we can undertake and implement, plan to advance ocean-based climate solutions, is there any actions in the Mid-Atlantic that would particularly be most important, since you guys didn't get to participate in the Mentimeter poll, or maybe low-hanging fruit actions that would be easy to just get started now? And maybe we could start with Mackenzie, since you said that there's hundreds of actions in the Ocean Climate Action Plan. Do you have any opinion on what might be useful and easy for the Mid-Atlantic to start on? Yes.
Yeah, I would say that, the Ocean Climate Action Plan, it does include some projects that are already going on, as well as future projects. So I think engaging with those federal agencies that are involved in that process, because I think there's a lot of stuff that's currently going on that folks can weigh in on. And that spans, throughout the report. I think coastal resilience obviously is a big one. There's a lot of BIL and IRA funding that's going towards coastal resilience efforts. I think it's about $4 billion in IRA alone. So there's definitely areas where folks can engage at the local level with those agencies and also work through that funding process to get projects going.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment on this?
I don't know if this is where I was originally starting with it, but I think one thing I'd really like to see is some type of a coordinated effort. It doesn't have to be a prolonged one, but a real opportunity for the folks who are working both in ocean-based stuff, but also on the coastal side, from federal agencies and state agencies coming together and sort of brainstorming more seriously and bringing in some research and scientists to have that conversation. A real active, pen to paper working session that's a little bit more focused on how we bring these actions and better communicate the narrative on the connectivity between ocean-based and coastal resiliency projects. I think we find a lot more ease in the coastal areas just because the challenges are literally running up on shore. You can't, you don't need a model for it, you literally see it. And I think right now, we kind of work in spaces a little bit separate and out. Sometimes we're a little afraid to bring in too many people, but I think on this one specific issue area, we really need a strong facilitated working group on that.
Thank you. Paul?
I hesitate to call it low-hanging fruit because there's some obvious pieces, and it doesn't mean they're easy. Fisheries compensation. I know there's a regional model that's being discussed about how do we standardize fisheries compensation. I think rather than have us all individual developers do it piece by piece, let's congregate, let's set clear rules, transparent processes. And then similarly, like I mentioned, environmental surveys, right? We should all be working off the same bird information. We should all be if you could even go further and set up passive acoustic monitoring systems up and down the East Coast to help us better understand whale density, whale abundance, whale distribution, real-time understanding of presence of whale species. That's one I think developers are interested in supporting, and I think we could all collectively, no one is going to, entity, agency, or developer is going to have enough resources or bandwidth or geographic scope to do it, so that's one that requires us to work together.
That's a great point. And so, a lot of what I'm hearing right now is that engagement across multiple different institutions is going to be necessary. And sort of what we heard from Miranda is that sometimes engagement is not always great. So how, in your opinion, how can we engage most effectively with the communities that are being affected that may want to benefit from these ocean-based climate solutions? Miranda, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think one thing that I think about a lot is just sharing information about what's going on. And I worked for Maryland's Department of the Environment before I started grad school, and I follow them on Instagram. And I found out more about what's happening in the environment in Maryland through that than I do anywhere else. Even like the recent ban on intentional balloon releases, I wouldn't have known that otherwise. And I just think about how many other people, like my parents and neighbors in Maryland who don't really even know what initiatives are happening. And there's just so much going on. And I think just awareness about what's currently happening to get people involved or interested. It's a hard thing to do, but I think it is an area for improvement.
I just want to, absolutely, and I think part of it is also, who is the stakeholder that we're talking about, and usually what you think initially, it's a much longer list than that. There was this really fascinating article that I read, and it talked about a completely different subject, which I don't want it to distract from the conversation today, but it really talked about the histories of American history and the different the starting of America and as it formed into the country that we know it today, obviously not originally, but it talked about how different parts of European countries and others, how where those folks settled, where the settlements were, and what the history and values are, how that really feeds a lot into what the values of those particular regions are in the United States are today. And so we've been talking quite a bit about that on the psychology and behavioral sides and challenges with regards to climate change when we're talking about people. And I really think that like a really deep dive about what those concerns are, what the impacts, what's the value, what they really care about, and what culture is for them, and really taking that down to that granular level when we're talking about climate change really helps us to expand not only who we're talking about, but how we try to speak with them, what kind of education formats are useful for them, because you really can't inform someone if you're not being sensitive to what their challenges are and also what their view shed is.
Go ahead. Absolutely.
I would just say that, to build off of that, I think most important is to meet folks where they are. So making sure that, you're recognizing their history, their values, but also, getting the word out there. And that requires, innovative ideas. I think for too long, the federal government would just put up a posting. I think Miranda was talking about this a little bit, but if you didn't know where to go to find those, you might have a hard time applying to something. I've been really encouraged by some of the proposals that the agencies are doing on BIL and IRA, that they also have engagement strategies built into these offerings that they're putting out there, the requests for funding projects. And that's really gonna, I hope, engage those communities and make sure that they have the resources to actually apply for those. There's also technical assistance, which will help folks in everything from the planning process to also the execution of the projects as well too. So I think that will help some communities who may not have applied for federal funding in the past. I think that this will give them an opportunity to engage and put those proposals together and give that experience. So I think that's helpful.
Thank you. Go ahead, Paul.
And part of meeting people where they are too, and we're seeing this is and I think Miranda touched on this with procedural justice, is understanding those barriers to engagement, right? It's not simply, as Mackenzie said, just to put up a sign and say, hey, we're here, we'll listen. Maybe it's childcare, maybe it's transportation, maybe it's staff concerns that just aren't allowing a tribe or a community to engage. So how do we really understand that and understand passive engagement may not be enough? We need to go and help people get engaged. I will say BOEM is, in the new round of leases for the New York Bight, has more requirements for communication, fisheries communication plan, agency communication plan, tribal communication plans. I won't let BOEM get off completely on this. Some of the implementation has been clunky, but the intent is there, and we're the first iteration, and so we'll figure that out. But that kind of transparency about requiring developers to say, who have you talked to? What were the concerns you heard? How are you working to address those concerns to make that process more open and understandable for the public?
Thanks, Paul. And last question, we might have time for, that's probably it before we go into the audience Q&A, but so I heard during Sarah's presentation that the vessel speed reductions, it's also safer for marine animals. And so what do you all feel are those conservation measures that also impact climate-related actions that we can take action on? And do you think that they would be, more I guess, outstanding to the public because they're more tangible, like, oh, we're saving whales that everyone loves and adores. So what kind of climate-related actions in ocean conservation might be useful when engaging with stakeholders around climate actions?
I think in a related way to the slower vessel incentives, it's not a direct link, but in my mind it is. I think a lot about how much people learned about the shipping industry and the supply chain during the pandemic, and how not getting that Amazon box at their doorstep as quickly as they wanted to, there was a sense of appreciation still. There's an understanding that the world's like supply chain is an ecosystem, and one small ripple in it can have compounding effects throughout an entire industry. And I think that it created much more understanding of where folks, get things from abroad, how it gets to their door. I think that if we could help people understand that, like, next day shipping might cause a vessel to need to go faster in some sort of like working down the line, and how the supply chain works, if they could connect that with the health of our oceans, maybe they would not select next day shipping or something. I think that if we did through the same sense of meeting people where they are, like talking to people about kind of how these industries do, how they interact with them, and how they might be actually affecting them. If we could connect more like people's day-to-day lives to the ocean health, like that's a very small example, but I think maybe people would appreciate it more.
I think that's a great point. Basically, we need global emergencies to help people understand their connection to the ocean and the climate.
Exactly.
No, I'm just kidding. Thank you. I'm gonna go ahead and open it up to audience questions now. Is there anyone that would like to ask a question? Please come up to a microphone. And maybe while people are formulating questions, I can see if there's any questions from the virtual audience. Janet?
Yeah, we have a couple.
Great.
The first one is for Mackenzie. A lot of sub-goals, this is for the OCAP, a lot of the sub-goals under carbon neutral themes are in preliminary/limited model/experimental stages. Could you elaborate more on how these will be affected?
I think as you read through the OCAP, there are a lot of research areas, and I think, excuse me, sorry. I think there's real opportunities to collaborate on some of that research across federal agencies and ensure that we are bringing these new ideas and themes to bear. I think that the Ocean Policy Committee is going to be coordinating some of that action across the federal agencies to make sure that they are talking to one another and collaborating on those. There's a lot of pilot projects within the OCAP as well too, which I think will be great opportunities to test out some of those new technologies. So I think that's a really great area. Although I do know, I think it was Paul or someone was saying about pilot projects and how it's hard sometimes to get those going. So I think as we work through that process, that will help inform future research and also future areas for opportunity.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Any other questions? I see we have someone heading down, so feel free. I'm not sure if the mic is turned on.
Hello, hello.
Oh, good. Great.
It is. Hi, I'm Mary Camway with the Wildlife Conservation Society, and that may give away a little bit of what I want to ask you about, which is wildlife. So this has been a great conversation for me, really, really interesting to think about the equity aspects. We're very much engaged in those questions. But when it comes to equity, a lot of times with climate change and these panels that I've heard, we think about just one species, and that's the human species, the impacts on humans. And what I would like you maybe just riff a little bit on how we can integrate this more broadly to engage wildlife and habitats, et cetera, in the work that you all are thinking about and doing. I know we're going to talk about that in another session, but here I'd like to specifically think about it in terms of climate impacts.
Just briefly, because I'm glad other folks are, but, for me at least, this is why I say we need to cast a wider period of time when we're talking about climate resilience, right? Because wildlife has been affected by climate change, and folks have been raising the alarm for that for a very, very long time. And so when I say we need to cast a wide lens and a longer cast, part of that is so that we are looking at all of this as a combined ecosystem of effect and impact, and recognizing that that does make creating solutions even more entangled, but that is really, truly the only way to get us to a more safer future.
I think Kisha says it well when we sort of have to look at the risk of not acting. So I think the National Environmental Policy Act, and I might get a little philosophical here, actually allows the government a good opportunity to weigh risks, right? NEPA doesn't require an outcome. It requires you to assess alternatives. And then it allows a wise decision maker to sort of adjudicate amongst those alternatives and mix and pick one. And so in that regard, it isn't a law that allows you to take that broad perspective that Kisha's talking about and say, what are the pros and cons of acting here? Any project is going to have risk. I would argue offshore wind projects are some of the most researched infrastructure projects, any projects out there. Construction operations plans, 35 technical reports, 6,000 pages of documents. They go through public review. They're pretty well studied, right? If there's an environmental issue that you're interested in, it's probably in that construction and operations plan somewhere. That said, it doesn't tell you what to do. The NEPA process allows the public to weigh in, the other agencies to weigh in, and they get to do those trade-offs. But I think we could be better at incorporating what's the risk of not acting and the risk of not building this project. And I think so, but there is this line of discussion that's going on. If we need a Marshall Plan to address climate change, there's an article by a law professor, J.B. Rule, that says, what happens when the Green New Deal meets old green laws? Right? So I spent 20 years as a federal manager with the Department of the Interior implementing the Endangered Species Act. It's 50 plus years old and we're still trying to figure out how to implement it, right? These things are hard. And I'm not sure the existing green laws are going to get us there. We need to be able to make those trade-offs and say there are going to be impacts. There are going to be short-term impacts, potentially to whales, potentially to birds, to bats. But how do we understand the trade-off of those potential short-term, maybe some long-term impacts to the risk of not acting? Climate change is changing the environment for birds and bats and whales. How do you assess those impacts from putting this project out there, putting these projects out there, or not putting these projects out there? I think there's work to be done on that.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Janet, is there?
This one is for Sarah. Many of the Port Authority's assets are really vulnerable to sea level rise. As you increase the resilience of those assets, for example, hardening and flooding, how do you engage nearby communities, especially if the Port Authority actions will impact flooding in those areas?
Thanks. So that's a great question. So we take a variety of approaches when we look at a project and we assess the risk from sea level rise and storm surge. Our climate resilience design guidelines take a code plus approach where if there's going to be during the life of the project a risk to damage or disruption, then we will seek to not only protect it, but actually add in also a sea level rise adjustment commensurate with how long we anticipate using a piece of infrastructure, an asset, or a building. And the approaches that we can take are varied, and so we do take into account what makes sense for the context. Everything is very contextual. We have substations, for example, along the path corridor, where we've built flood walls or elevated. And in that case, they're not near any neighborhoods. We're far away from anyone except for maybe some passing Conrail trains or something. So it makes sense in that context. But then in other contexts, like we just rebuilt the head houses for the Harrison Path Station, and in that case, we took into account what the community might want new infrastructure to look like. So instead of building a flood wall, the path station, you step up to an elevated plaza, and the landscaping there manages stormwater, irrigates the vegetation that we've put in there. And so when you're in a neighborhood context, the best resilience measures that you can take really fit in seamlessly with the local community. And so you're protecting a critical asset, but you're not harming in any way the fabric of the community. And similarly, we have a lot of embedded, PATH is the best example because those stations are embedded within the communities of Jersey City and Hoboken and Harrison. So at a lot of our other stations, we are putting in just in time sort of flood barriers that'll be deployed by our staff right before an impending storm. So again, you don't necessarily notice that we've updated or hardened one of our stations. You'll just, right before a storm, those will be closed for your safety, and we'll be able to keep the floodwaters out. So we don't have another Sandy where the water cascades down into the platforms and we have to, update the electrical for years and years to come, impacting the service to the communities. So that is really our biggest focus is figuring out what makes the most sense to, during construction, be as undisruptive to the community and continue service while we're upgrading our facilities, and then after we've upgraded our facilities, you really ideally you don't really notice a difference. It's just a more resilient, better operating facility for the community.
Thank you very much for answering. So that concludes our session today. I'd like to thank all of these wonderful panelists. They have really done an excellent job up here. Thank you so much. And now you all get to go to lunch. If you're unaware, on the back of your pamphlet here, there are location recommendations. There's a QR code at the bottom. It'll bring up a map of those locations so you can easily access them. And come back at 1:30 because we have a lot of awesome stuff to do this afternoon. Thank you.